The port of Hamburg. From here, German products are shipped to countries all over the world. In return, around 9 million containers arrive here every year, most of them from China. The city in northern Germany is a gateway to Europe for goods from Asia. And when they enter the EU, many products are subject to import duties. Cars from Asia and the US are taxed at 10%, clothing at 12%. Smartphones aren't taxed at all. We've come to the town of Hildburghausen in the German state of Thüringen, home to Wolfgang Renner's company Merida and Centurion. The former top cyclocross cyclist was the man who brought mountain biking to Germany in a big way. Today, he's a successful entrepreneur. The company offers a range of models, and business is booming. So, where do the bikes come from? This bike, it's made in Germany.
No, it's not made in Germany.
But it's a German brand.
Yeah, it's a German brand.
So where does the frame come from?
Like so many things, the frame comes from China. It's painted and assembled in Taiwan. Quality control all happens here. A bike designed in Germany, assembled in Taiwan from components manufactured in China. Made in this way, a bike like this pays a 15% import duty when it arrives in the EU. But if it was shipped directly to Germany from a factory in China, the importer would have to pay almost 50% in punitive tariffs. Why? Because a Chinese company can make bikes much more cheaply than a German firm ever could.
20 years growing, has become the world's largest bicycle manufacturing leading enterprises. The group we have established.
In this promotional video, Chinese bicycle manufacturer Fushida claims it has the largest bike factory in the world.
By the international first-class production technology. And more than 100 robots welding machines.
Companies like these are subsidized by the Chinese government. But that's just one reason Chinese products are so cheap. There's also scale.
Are creating miracles one after another.
With a production capacity of 100 million bicycles a year, China could quickly swamp the world with its products.
Of various markets all over the world.
Companies like Wolfgang Renner's would go under, so he sees the import tariffs as protecting Europe's bicycle manufacturing industry. Tariffs on bikes from China, they began to arrive from Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other places. When it grew clear that the bikes were actually being made by Chinese firms, punitive tariffs against those countries were put in place. Then, Tunisia began exporting them, and was soon slapped with tariffs. Today, components for the bikes are still mostly made in China, but the frames are finished elsewhere, like Taiwan. Because that's where the rules say value is added, the bikes are then no longer subject to punitive tariffs when they're imported into the EU. Germany really does profit immensely from global trade. In 2017, it exported goods worth over 1.2 trillion euros. Like China, that makes the EU a big net exporter. Germany has a whopping 250 billion euros trade surplus. The US has a deficit of around 500 billion, with many more goods and services flowing in than flowing out. Ongoing debt has long-term consequences for America. If borders closed and protectionism reigned. It's happened before. At the beginning of the 20th century, world trade and globalization really took off, but it soon hit major speed bumps. The US slid into the Great Depression. Germany faced a huge economic crisis of its own. And protectionism suddenly reared its head. Voices calling for isolationist policies grew loud. During the 1930s, the US began to adopt an increasingly aggressive protectionist stance, raising tariffs drastically to protect American industries and jobs. Germany also put up barriers to international trade. The mixture of protectionism and nationalism ended in the horrors of the Second World War.
There were disastrous developments in world trade. In terms of volume, it fell by 2/3 within 4 years. By today's standards, that's unimaginable. If we saw a 5% fall in trade, people would call it a major crisis. But back then it fell drastically and dramatically. And that development can be traced back to protectionist policies put in place by the United States of America.
To prevent other major conflicts, the body that would eventually become the World Trade Organization was set up, headquartered in Geneva. Its fundamental principle, that free trade brings prosperity for all, has never really been accepted. On the contrary, the WTO has come under heavy fire in recent years. And the US, led by Donald Trump, largely ignores it. Cameroon. Mamembale is on her way to her plantation. The path takes her through the jungle. She's the head of a village cooperative located in the rainforest north of Yaoundé. The walk takes about an hour in each direction. There's no street. The cooperative members harvested over 2 tons of onions here last year and sold the crop at a market in the distant capital. The proceeds fed the entire village.
We use onions as a remedy. For example, when you have digestive complaints. We use it as an antiseptic, and we make our sauces with onions. Cameroonians wouldn't know what to do without onions.
Now the women from the village are planting cassava instead, not because they want to, but because it no longer makes sense to plant onions. Onions imported from Europe have destroyed the market. To protect farmers like these, Cameroon would have to raise import duties even more. But it can't, because a new free trade agreement with the EU, called EPA, prohibits that.
Our onion fields stretched from here down to the river and over there. But then we stopped being able to sell all of them because of the huge number of imports. That's why we had to stop growing them.
Onions are a staple here. The African country consumes hundreds of thousands of tons a year. Until now, they were all grown domestically. 50 kilometers south, at a market in Yaoundé, it's growing harder and harder to find onions grown domestically. Every morning, trucks arrive here filled with onions. Most of them have been imported from Holland. They're the ones packaged in red nets. Mamembale has dressed up for the trip to Yaoundé to talk about the onion issue. She's meeting up with Yvonne Takang, who heads up an office that examines the effect free trade is having on everyday consumers here. The two discover that Dutch onions cost around 1/3 less than homegrown varieties. But how can that be when there's already a 30% punitive import tariff on the vegetable? And as though the cheap onions weren't bad enough for the farmers, other agricultural products like garlic from China are also flooding markets in the fruitful country.
We have no chance, as you can see. We are asking time to protect our domestic markets first and build our economies before thinking of opening our markets to the world.
European overproduction is undercutting Africa's agriculture sector. Mamembale doesn't know what to do next. What happened with onions could happen just as easily with other farm products. And the new free trade agreements with the EU don't allow Cameroon to raise punitive tariffs any further to protect the industry.
I think it's high time they understand that they should leave African countries to build their own markets, just as the EU took time to build its own markets. It's time to let us build our markets, and then we can think partnership agreements with the EU.
In other words, Europeans are denying Africans what they need most: the right to institute measures to protect their still vulnerable agriculture sector. All industrialized countries, including Germany, were only able to grow into economic heavyweights because they initially threw up big barriers to foreign competition. But that fact is conveniently forgotten nowadays. Without protectionism, in other words, Germany never would have turned into the industrial powerhouse it later became. Back in the 19th century, the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck closed borders to keep out imports of wood and grain from Russia. And Britain also protected itself by coming up with the Made in Germany label. At the time, it was meant to identify cheap, mass-produced knives. Only later did the description grow to have positive connotations.
Countries preach free trade principles when they themselves are especially competitive, and they preach it for the sectors where they're especially competitive. But in areas where they're less competitive, they allow protectionism, like in agriculture in Europe.
Germany subsidizes every hectare of farmland in the country to the tune of €280 annually. In all, countries in Europe invest around €60 billion every year in agriculture. But that encourages the overproduction of milk and pork, which are dumped cheap on the Chinese market. That's the other hidden side of European protectionism. And the Americans do it as well. Farmers there also receive huge subsidies, while giant agribusiness multinationals export produce all over the world. The biggest losers in that equation are small farmers in poor countries. Which brings us back to Cameroon. For years, European firms exported poultry parts here that no one in Europe wanted. That destroyed Agnes Koa's breeding business. No one bought her Cameroonian chickens anymore, at least until the country decided to be more protectionist and barred imports of chicken parts. Since then, business has slowly picked up. People in her village are slowly beginning to raise birds for sale again. Koa is a well-known figure in the area. She's happy to show us her small farm. She hopes that things now will get a little better. Companies in Cameroon, for instance, could begin building powerful motorcycles. Today, they all come from China. Free trade does bring prosperity to some people, but it also widens the gap between rich and poor. The richest 10% of humanity now owns 90% of the wealth on the planet. The poorest 50% of the world's population has to make do with almost nothing, just 0.2% of the wealth. The winners are those who can afford to invest in global concerns. Google parent company Alphabet has quintupled in value in the last few years. Apple's value has risen by a factor of 10. During the same period, the world economy has only grown by about a third. But capital flows across borders wherever money can be made. So the finance sector also profits at a vast scale from free trade. The problem is there are no global rules for taxation. That allows big companies to park billions in offshore tax havens like the Cayman Islands or Panama. There are no global controls in the areas where they have the potential to make a difference to the world's poorest. That's why protests are growing louder, like this one, at a WTO meeting in Buenos Aires. Critics say the organization is little more than a cartel, there to protect the interests of the powerful industrialized nations and global concerns. People like Mama Mbale have few chances in a world like that, because without protectionism, trade can never be fair.
Food production in particular has to be shielded from cheap competition, whether in developing countries or industrialized ones.
If we want to continue producing food products in the region rather than in the cheapest place in the world, and if the products only follow the highest purchasing power, then the only way to sustain that is with protectionism, but a positive protectionism based on sustainability.
Africa doesn't need fetters. It needs protection while its industries grow. And only when that happens will the flood of migrants to Europe searching for a better life finally slow. Francisco Mari says the current model is fundamentally flawed.
The rules of world trade are actually made to allow big countries to invest in small ones and gain access to their resources. There's a lot of hypocrisy there, especially in agriculture. Everyone bangs on about how we need free trade, but is busy protecting themselves in a huge way with subsidies to their own farmers. So it's a two-faced deception, crying out for free trade internationally while practicing protectionism at home. That won't work. It's unfair, and I believe there's no future in it.
The global exchange of goods is always a fight for prosperity. And in the end, there are winners and losers. Trade that is truly free is a myth and will always remain one.